The day the State University of Oregon opened its doors was clear and warm. There were no ceremonies to mark the beginning, no processions, no speeches by the people of Lane County who had given the university to the state. Neither local nor state politicians showed up for the occasion. The university's president offered no promises and shared no vision of his goals. Instead, President John Wesley Johnson simply began registering students. More than 100 prospective students lined up to be examined for entrance and classification that first Monday. More students arrived all week. Soon, 155 had registered and classes were underway. It was an austere beginning, and it hadn't even started to rain. There were those in the state who feared the university might not survive, and others who hoped it would fail. Oregonians had been arguing about higher education since before Oregon was a state. At the Constitutional Convention of 1857, the delegates had to decide what to do with the federal government's land grant for a state university. Under the Donation Act of 1850, the federal government would give new states 72 sections of land, slightly more than 46,000 acres, for the use and support of a university. Generally, that meant the state could sell the land and use the money for higher education. But most of the delegates of 1857 didn't think Oregon needed a state university. They were led in that belief by the president of Oregon's Constitutional Convention, Judge Matthew Deedy. Deedy, one of the most powerful politicians in the Oregon Territory, would come to change his mind. But in 1857, Deedy believed a university sponsored by the state would be managed in the interest of political factions. The Episcopalian judge feared that an Oregon university would be controlled by the Methodists, not only the territory's dominant religious denomination, but also an exceptionally strong political force. Others in his camp argued that the territory's population was too small to support a public university. Deedy's viewpoint prevailed. The convention voted 27 to 15 to remove the constitutional clause providing for a state university. Then they voted to set aside the university fund so that it could not be spent for at least 10 years. The delegates' attitudes reflected their pioneer culture. Many of Oregon's early settlers had come from Midwest states where public high schools and universities had not yet developed. Higher education was simply not part of their cultural tradition. In fact, most Oregonians had only a 3rd or 4th grade education. For the few who wanted more than that, there were some sectarian colleges, though most did not offer much more than the equivalent of a secondary school education. In the 1850s, the Methodists had founded Willamette University in Salem. The Baptists had established McMinnville, now known as Linfield. The Congregationalists had founded Pacific University, and in Monmouth, the Disciples in Christ had established Christian College. In Eugene, efforts to found a college hadn't fared so well. The Cumberland Presbyterians established Columbia College in 1856. The building burned 4 days after it opened. The fire was blamed on arsonists, and a congregation deeply divided over slavery. The college was rebuilt, and it was torched again. A 3rd stone building was never used. The Presbyterians abandoned the college in 1859 after the congregation fractured over whether there should be Bible reading and prayer in the classrooms. By 1872, some of the leading businessmen of Eugene were ready to try again. It was a time of growth and optimism. The Civil War had ended 7 years earlier. Now the closest conflict was in the lava beds of Northern California, where the Modoc Indians were under siege by the U.S. Army. There were 2 newspapers in town, one for the Republicans and one for the Democrats. There were 5 churches. The city's new brass band had started practicing in March, and in April, Eugene Hook and Ladder Company No. 1 had been organized for fire protection. Less than a year before, the O&C Railroad had reached town. Eugene was a city on the move. During the summer, the city's leaders started talking about building a public high school. They set their sights a little higher after they received a visit from Thomas Campbell, the president of Christian College in Monmouth. Campbell had an idea, and he was looking for support. Campbell believed the 1872 legislature was finally going to authorize a state university. Campbell wanted the legislature to select his college to be that university. His incentive? He could use the rich, untapped state university fund to run his institution. The Eugene men liked Campbell's idea all right. They liked it so much, they swiped it and shaped it into a proposal for a university in Eugene. In August of '72, the Lane County men formed the Union University Association, the UUA. The first board of directors included Judge J.M. Thompson, Dr. A.W. Patterson, Judge Joshua J. Walton, and businessmen Thomas Hendricks, Ben Doris, Will Abrams, and William J.J. Scott. By the time the legislature convened in September, the Lane County delegation had prepared a university bill. In exchange for the state declaring Eugene the permanent location of the State University of Oregon, the UUA would build a university worth $50,000 and give it to the state. The building was to be finished no later than January 1st, 1874. A board of regents would run it, and it was to be a non-sectarian institution. Religious tests for either students or teachers would be forbidden. Of the 4 university proposals before the legislature in 1872, Eugene's was the only non-denominational plan. For many lawmakers, that made Eugene their choice by default. If they couldn't have their church run the university, they certainly didn't want any other church running the university. The legislature narrowly selected the Eugene proposal over those of Albany College, Christian College, and Pacific University. The UUA went to work, and at first, things went smoothly. By January, the UUA had selected a marshy 5-acre site near the center of Eugene. In March of 1873, the UUA requested bids for 600,000 bricks for the building, and it was well on its way towards raising $50,000 for the project. Lane County had voted to contribute $30,000 with a bond issue. That left only $20,000 to be raised through private donations, and people were already stepping forward with their pledges. The first problem was the location. The Board of Commissioners for State Lands, consisting of the governor, the state treasurer, and the Secretary of State, hand-delivered a velvet-covered threat to the UUA on April 21st. In it, they pointed out that while they didn't have the power to designate a site for the university, they would have to approve it before the state would accept the building. Then they spelled out their requirements. The university should be on high ground to facilitate drainage. The drainage of the university cesspool should not affect any nearby wells. And the site would need an abundant supply of good water. They pointed out that land offered by the Reverend J.H.D. Henderson would satisfy their concerns completely. The UUA met that night and, not too surprisingly, decided to build on the Henderson property. Henderson donated part of the land for the university and charged $100 an acre for the rest of it, 17 3/4 acres of land about a mile east of Eugene, just across the road from the old McMurray place. The next problem was money. The Panic of 1873 had launched a nationwide depression. Money was scarce, crop prices were down, and as tax time rolled around in Lane County, the $30,000 bond issue for the university became an easy target. Opponents said the university would serve only the wealthy, and they called for its relocation to another community. The university's supporters argued that Eugene needed the economic development opportunities a university would bring. They said land values would increase and wealthy tax-paying families would move to Eugene to educate their children. They argued that having a university nearby would elevate the moral standards of the community. The groundbreaking went ahead as scheduled May 7th. On May 10th, Lane County rescinded the $30,000 university bond issue. With the majority of their funding gone, the UUA swallowed hard and 3 days later went ahead and awarded the brick contract. The magnitude of that decision is remarkable. Consider these numbers. There were 1,100 people living in Eugene in 1873, just 220 families. 140 subscribers had pledged $15,000 to at least start the construction of the University of Oregon. Those who couldn't give money offered their skill, their labor, or even a portion of their crops. The Gillespies, Grays, Lempels, Scotts, and Richardsons, among others, gave bushels of wheat. Isaac Zumwalt gave $17 and a cow. John Thompson offered money and 2 cords of wood. And in June, Daniel Norris walked in a mare for which the university received $80. The ladies of the Episcopal Church raised $37.50 at a benefit. It all counted. The building started going up. The UUA could only pay for day labor and building materials. They had to postpone paying for the land, the iron, the contractors, even the services of the architect. Even with that, by the fall of 1873, only the basement and outer walls were finished. Before the rains destroyed the building, UUA director Ben Doris raised the money himself and installed a roof. The 1874 legislature gave Eugene a 2-year extension, so the UUA went back to fundraising. A county-wide campaign raised $6,000 in cash. The Lane County Grangers donated wheat worth another $6,000. There still wasn't enough money. Most suppliers were now taking cash only. Judge Walton was paying the bills for the UUA. If he had no cash on payday, he would leave his law office and go out into the country looking for donations. In later years, people remembered him coming into town carrying a box of apples or leading a calf or some pigs. He would take the goods to Friendly's store and sell them so that the workmen could be paid. Towards the end, school children went door to door collecting money to pay for the glass in the windows of the building. In the spring of '76, enough of the building was finished to hold classes. Before it could be transferred to the state, some of the unpaid contractors filed a $5,000 lien against the building. UUA Director W.J.J. Scott personally paid those bills. It would be a long time before he and several other creditors got their money back. In July, the state inspected and accepted its new state university. Architect William Piper had designed the university building in the Second Empire style. The building stood alone on a bare hill, save for 2 old oaks just to the north. There were 6 finished classrooms on the first floor. The ceilings were 16 feet high. The floor was 2 feet thick, a wooden sandwich filled with earth, designed to muffle sound and preserve heat.
Wood stoves could radiate heat. It would be absorbed by the earth and maintain a kind of even heat throughout the day and night. So pretty innovative for its time.
And pretty heavy. The brick-bearing walls at the bottom of the building were 3 feet thick to handle the weight. The exterior was red brick made with clay excavated from a hill a mile south.
And it was a good clay, but not terrific clay. The bricks that were made from it were good bricks, but not terrific bricks.
In fact, the bricks started to disintegrate in the rain. Within 15 years, they would need to be coated.
Kind of a waterproofing. It was a process done at that time called parging, which is like a waterproof stucco.
The Board of Regents met in early August. Matthew Deedy, now a U.S. District Court judge, had become the board's president. Judge Walton was the secretary. The regents passed bylaws and elected a faculty of 5. The opening day was set. Advertisements were published in newspapers throughout the state. There would be 2 20-week terms in the school year. College tuition was $20 a term, with an incidental fee of $2.50. Preparatory school tuition was $15. By the middle of October, the city was filling with students. Nearly half of them would enroll in the prep school. The university had to offer these high school classes. That's because in 1876 there were only 2 public high schools in Oregon, one in La Grande, the other in Portland. Of the private academies, few were suitably preparing students for college entrance. The university itself offered a classical education patterned on the traditions of Yale and Harvard. Students took Latin, Greek, mathematics, philosophy, and science. There were no electives, no lab experiments for science, no modern languages, no literature classes, and no athletics. The emphasis was on composition and the recitation of memorized facts. The idea was to discipline the mind of the student, not necessarily teach them useful information. The curriculum suited President John Wesley Johnson perfectly. He himself was a graduate of Yale, and he was teaching what he had learned the way he had learned it. Johnson was 40 years old when the university opened. He'd been the president of McMinnville Baptist College and the first principal of the Portland High School. He was a short man, known for his severity, sarcasm, common sense, and dry wit. He was not only president of the university, but also the professor of Latin and Greek. In a recording made in 1954, a graduate of the class of 1893 remembered Johnson for his toughness.
The students all had a great deal of respect for J.W. Johnson because of his ability as a teacher, and also because of his strictness and sternness. He just simply did not permit any frivolity, and he had no use for any student who didn't have his lessons.
The townspeople generally liked him. He hunted, fished, enjoyed an occasional beer, and the frequent use of tobacco.
There was a box stove in his room. He'd sit in front of that box stove even when classes were in session, and he'd spit in the stove.
The professor of mathematics was Mark Bailey. The 6'3" Baptist minister had graduated from Brown University. He was theologically conservative, passionate about astronomy, and not as tough as Johnson.
He was very severe with these students in his mathematics and astronomy classes, very severe with them, but he was much more kindly.
Thomas Condon was the professor of natural sciences. The diminutive Irishman had graduated from the Auburn Theological Seminary and was ordained a congregational minister. Condon came to Oregon in 1853 as a missionary for the pioneers. Condon was also a scientist. Geology and the study of fossils fascinated him. Eventually, he wrote a book on the geology of Oregon, most of it based on his own research and discoveries. He was well known throughout Oregon as a lecturer. He had reconciled for himself Christian theology and the theory of evolution, and he spoke eloquently on the subject.
He was by far the best known of the faculty members out in the state, so that attracted students.
He was gentle, kind, and genuinely interested in his students, and they loved him.
Condon, by far, was the most friendly to his students. The students had a column that they wrote, and Condon was more frequently mentioned than any of the others, and oftentimes for his kindness.
The principal for the preparatory school was Mary Boise Spiller. She had graduated from Mount Holyoke and was described as being severe but thorough as a teacher. Spiller was the sister of Reuben Boise, a colleague on the federal bench with Matthew Deedy. Spiller's assistant was Mary Stone, a graduate of St. Helens Hall in Portland. She was Judge Deedy's niece. He wrote in his diary that he supposed the regents had selected her as a compliment to him. She only lasted a year. President Johnson's salary was set at $2,500 a year, with Bailey and Condon to receive $2,000 each. Mary Spiller was hired at $1,200 a year, and Mary Stone, $800. The pay was respectable for the time and the positions, if only they'd received it. It soon became apparent that the state's management of the university fund had been a farce. The State Land Board had sold much of the land grant acreage for a fraction of its worth, and then loaned much of what they got for the land without requiring any security. After his own investigation, Judge Matthew Deedy reported to the legislature that there should have been $200,000 in the fund. There was only $66,000. Such pillaging wasn't against the law at the time. Judge Deedy changed that with the University Act he drafted and pushed to the legislature that year. In the future, fund loans would be carefully approved and secured, but in 1876, the new university was in a financial bind. The interest from the land grant fund would yield only $3,500. Tuition payments wouldn't help much, since nearly a third of the students had state-mandated full scholarships. So the regents balanced the budget at the faculty's expense. By the end of the year, they had withheld $1,000 of the president's pay, $500 from both Condon and Bailey, $300 from Spiller, and $200 from Stone. The legislature appropriated $10,000 to finish the upper levels of the university building, but did nothing about the faculty salaries. In early 1878, the regents rewrote the faculty contracts, officially reducing their wages by 20%. The faculty would wait 11 years until 1887 to be restored to the pay scale they had originally been promised. The college students had other things on their minds. Classes, of course. During the winter months, if students didn't have a class scheduled during a period, they ended up in the hall. It was too far to go back to town and usually too wet to go outside. And if they talked to each other in the hallway, and they usually did, the noise they made would interrupt classes. Then the wrath of President Johnson would fall upon them. He lectured them weekly about the noise. He herded them into his office and made them stand silently. He threw water on them. None of it worked. Within 2 weeks of the beginning of classes in 1876, the students formed debating societies. The faculty allowed them the use of the recitation rooms on Fridays for their separate meetings. The women called their group the Eutaxians. The men organized the Lorians. They were far more than debating societies, though they did worry over wonderful issues such as the future of the republic, the necessity of morality, the value of unions, and the wisdom of public power. These societies were, for a time, the unofficial representatives of all the students. They petitioned for a gymnasium, for theater, for a school paper. They were usually turned down. When the students could not have drama on campus, they put on plays with the people in town. When they couldn't have their own paper, they wrote columns for the city papers. The students brought the first library to campus. The Eutaxians and Lorians bought the books from a failed Eugene library and installed them in their meeting room. The social highlight each term was the joint meeting of the Eutaxians and Lorians. Weeks of planning went into the event. All participants arrived in their finest attire. Needless to say, chaperones were present. The faculty had established rules for student conduct. They came to be known as the 10 Commandments. Students were forbidden to enter a saloon, drink alcohol, smoke, or swear. They couldn't talk in the halls, block doorways, stay out after 11, or go to public dances. The regents decided women could only use the university's east staircase, the men only the west. The regents worried that the women's ankles might otherwise be seen as they climbed the stairs. Most of the students lived downtown. They paid $3 to $4 a week to lodge in a private home or slightly more to live in a boarding house. It was about a mile to the university from downtown Eugene, and that wasn't a problem unless it rained. When classes began in 1876, the city still hadn't started building a sidewalk to the campus. Now, it rains in Eugene. A lot. Before there were sidewalks and pavement, there were mud holes. According to a Roseburg newspaper account in the 1880s, rain turned Willamette Street into a sea of quivering mud. Mud as thick as a boarding house custard and about the same color. An historian of the time related a story about Eugene's quagmire, reporting that it is of so fine a quality and so deep that 2 hogs rooting in the streets sank out of sight to be forever lost to view. We can only hope the story was apocryphal. We know the mud was not. Even after the wooden sidewalk was completed in December of 1876, it needed tending. If it had been scraped with shovels, it was passable. If not, pedestrians might find themselves wading through 6 inches of mud. When the students got to school, they picked up firewood and carried it in for the stoves heating their classrooms. The university burned 46.5 cords of wood the first year alone. Lighting came from kerosene lamps. Privies lined one outside wall of the university. It would be 17 years before there would be indoor plumbing and 21 years before the building was electrified. Oregon's first class graduated in 1878. 4 men and 1 woman received their diplomas from Judge Deedy. Nellie Condon, the professor's daughter, was the valedictorian. Deedy was the speaker. He advised the class to promote learning, restrain the strong, protect the weak, fight evil, and practice politeness. The university started to grow. In 1878, the university hired John Straub to teach modern languages. Physics professor George Collier came to Oregon the next year. he and his wife built a lovely home on the east edge of the campus. Things were looking up for the university until the sheriff threatened to sell the building during the summer of 1881. The Union University Association debts had come back to haunt the campus. With the association no longer in existence, but many of its debts still unpaid, creditors had successfully sued the state. On appeal, the Supreme Court had upheld the judgment against the university. Slightly more than $8,000 was owed. It was fundraising time again. Within a month, Eugene donors had pledged $3,400. The faculty had pledged more than half of that total, and it still wasn't enough. Rescue, when it came, was unexpected. Judge Deedy received a telegram from his friend Henry Villard. The New York financier and president of the Northern Pacific Railroad had read about the university's financial embarrassment. He offered his help. Villard paid off $7,000 of the debt. Eugene's citizens paid off the rest. The building was finally, truly debt-free. Villard announced more contributions, $1,000 for a library, $1,000 for scientific equipment, and 5 $50 scholarships. Villard also thought the university should offer English literature, so he pledged to pay the salary of a professor to teach it. He wasn't finished. A year later, he gave the university a $50,000 endowment with 2 conditions: that the state of Oregon begin contributing at least $5,000 a year to help support the university, and that the university spend at least $400 a year on books for the library. The State Journal reported on Villard's visit to campus in 1883, during which he very pleasantly corrected President Johnson when he mispronounced his name as Villard. It does not, he said, rhyme with Willard, and the D is not pronounced. The accent is on the last syllable. It's Villar. Other than the newspaper article, there is no evidence that anyone else was paying attention that day. Even in 1883, there were critics who thought Villard helped the university only to shape a more positive public image for himself. But there was no denying that his generosity had finally put the University of Oregon on solid financial footing. The future looked bright. By 1884, the survival of the State University of Oregon appeared to be assured. Thanks to the interest earned from Henry Villard's $50,000 endowment and the legislature's new $5,000 yearly appropriation, the future looked secure. But the university was becoming crowded. Professor Benjamin Hawthorne had joined the faculty. The new library donated by Villard was wedged into the back of Mark Bailey's classroom. There was little room to display the new cases built for Thomas Condon's fossil and mineral collection. Physics professor George Collier had run out of space for his scientific specimens. Preparatory school enrollment had exploded, and classes were being held in the third-floor auditorium. Fortunately, the state legislature appropriated $30,000 for a new building. In 1885, Eugene Society turned out for the laying of the cornerstone. Warren Williams designed the gray 2-story structure that rose to the north of the old building.
And it's meant to look like it came directly from France. If you take a look at the building, even though it's made of brick, the same bricks as Deedy, you will not read bricks, you will see stucco, which, by the way, has endured beautifully in these last 116 years, and you will see stucco that's meant to look like stones, fine, beautiful, cut stones. And then you're to look up and you'll see decorative elements, sometimes made of wood, sometimes made of brick, sometimes made of cast zinc, all sand painted so they look like carved pieces of stone.
It had 4 classrooms on the first floor and an assembly hall on the second, which immediately became Eugene's meeting place. In 1886, the regents unanimously voted to call it Villard Hall. Condon and Bailey moved into the new building. Condon crowded so many of his display cases into the new space that there was soon little room left for him or his classes. The campus was still mostly barren. In 1884, the janitor planted a double row of Douglas firs lining the west walkway to the old university building. And Sybil and George Collier also helped turn what is now the campus into an arboretum. Sybil was a botanist and planted a variety of exotic plants and flowers on the grounds. The university was growing in other ways as well, and the Regents didn't mind as long as it didn't cost any money. At Judge Matthew Deedy's urging in 1884, the Regents allowed an Englishman named Richard Thornton to organize a university law school in Portland. The Regents gave Thornton no money and little direction. Thornton found classrooms, registered students, and collected fees. He hired instructors, including Judge Matthew Deedy. The school offered evening classes and grew steadily. In 1886, D.W. Coolidge started the Department of Music at the university. His entire salary had to come out of fees paid by students. The program was popular, but Coolidge soon resigned over lack of support from the Regents. Mary McCornack replaced him. She was a graduate of the university and the New England Conservatory of Music. She taught in a corner of the assembly room. In 1887, Judge Deedy's brother-in-law, Curtis Strong, and several other physicians organized a university medical school in Portland. Simeon Josephi was the first dean. The Regents gave the doctors no money. They took out personal loans to build the university's new medical school, a two-room wooden structure costing $1,000. In 1892, they built a more modern structure. The university curriculum changed very little during this period. Theoretically, students could pursue 3 courses of study: the classical, scientific, or the literary. In reality, the 3 differed only in which language students were required to learn. In 1888, the first of the original faculty members resigned. The Regents elected Luella Clay Carson as the chair of rhetoric and elocution to replace Mary Spiller. Carson was a formidable Victorian of unassailable conviction. In her elocution classes, students learned not only public speaking, but also appropriate social behavior. Carson wrote a book on the rules of composition. She also taught the first journalism courses at Oregon. 3 years after she arrived, the faculty permitted the debating societies to publish a student newspaper, The Reflector. Carson was a natural choice to become the paper's advisor. She had rules. She was to edit everything the students wrote, and the students were not to use the paper to offer advice to either the Regents or the faculty. She once assured another professor quite seriously that
the healthy relations which exist between faculty and students are due entirely to press censorship.
The students, naturally, found ways to get around her. They would occasionally drop their final copy on her desk as they were leaving to have the paper printed. Soon after Carson arrived, 2 new buildings went up. In 1889, the university bought land on the top of Skinner's Butte and built an observatory on it. It didn't work out very well. Vandals stole the telescope. It was recovered, but after that it was kept on campus. The empty observatory became a stopover for tramps and eventually burned down. The next building was a gymnasium. Everyone agreed the students needed a place to exercise. President Johnson just didn't want them doing it on campus. Despite his objections, in 1890, the university built a small gym at the site of the present School of Architecture and Allied Arts. By 1893, President Johnson was at odds with the rest of the faculty over 2 other issues. The first was student housing. There simply wasn't enough of it available in Eugene. Over Johnson's objections, the faculty recommended that a dormitory be built on campus. They thought it would offer inexpensive and attractive housing and better allow them to supervise the students. The legislature agreed and appropriated $25,000 for the building. The second issue was the university's curriculum. Increasingly strident voices were pressing for the introduction of business classes. college enrollment dropped as students complained that what they were learning was of no use to them unless they wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a minister. In the Reflector, a student summed up the argument.
Give us something practical, something we can use in our business. We don't want your useless fripperies, your dead languages, and all your other antiquated nonsense.
The classical education offered at Oregon was almost outdated before the university opened. Progressive institutions such as Johns Hopkins and Stanford understood they were no longer educating only the elite of society. These universities were not only offering the traditional liberal arts, but also modern humanities, literature, history, anthropology, sociology, even economics and commerce. President Johnson thought commerce instruction had no place at a respectable university. But once again, the rest of the faculty outvoted him and recommended to the regents that the university offer business classes. President Johnson did not like it. Additionally, he had decided he would not be responsible for the behavior of dormitory students. On March 23rd, he wrote out his resignation. On March 24th in Portland, another road had come to an end. Judge Matthew Deedy died at the age of 69, probably due to prostate cancer. He'd been painfully ill for years and had repeatedly petitioned for early retirement. The government finally allowed Deedy to step down from the bench 3 weeks before he died. The regents met 6 days later. They accepted Johnson's resignation as president, but kept him on the faculty as the professor of Latin and ethics. They passed resolutions praising Johnson and Deedy, these strong-willed men who had protected, pushed, and bullied the university into existence. And then, the regents finally gave a name to the original university building. Henceforth, it would be known as Deedy Hall. Charles Hiram Chapman was only 32 years old when he became the University of Oregon's second president in 1893. Chapman had been a professor of mathematics who had earned his doctorate at Johns Hopkins University. The regents hired him sight unseen. He arrived in August and took rooms at Professor Mark Bailey's home, where a number of faculty members lived. Chapman wrote to a friend that Bailey repeatedly tried to engage him in a religious debate. Chapman said,
"I hate to make a pious man think I am wicked, but I will not argue about religion to please Gabriel himself."
Chapman thought the university was like a petty theological seminary run by elderly ministers. He found the regents determined for change and the faculty divided and fearful of the future. He went to work fast. Chapman first moved to liberalize the curriculum, introducing electives for juniors and seniors. The university started offering business, education, and engineering classes. Chapman then started to put the university in touch with the people of Oregon. The first year, he organized a series of 12 public lectures around the state. The next year, he offered extension classes. People in 32 communities signed up. He actively recruited students. He had no secretary, so he personally wrote 2,000 letters to high school students inviting them to attend the university. Enrollment started to rise. Student life was changing. In December of 1893, the dorm was finished and named after Sampson Friendly, a university founder and regent. Friendly Hall could house 90 students who paid $2.50 a week for room and board. The first year, Friendly was co-educational. Women lived at the north end, men at the south, with a wall separating the two halves. But it was the 1890s, and a co-ed dorm just didn't work out. After the first year, only men were allowed to live there. In 1896, the university purchased Professor Collier's home to serve as a women's dormitory. The next addition was an athletic field along Kincaid Street. Students had organized an athletic association in 1893 because they wanted football. Chapman let them have football, but he insisted that students had to maintain at least a B average if they were to play. On March 24th, 1894, Oregon's team played its first football game, winning against Albany 44-2. Track was organized in 1895. The Oregon team won the championship cup at a field meet in Salem that year. They won the next year, too. It almost became a habit. The faculty suspended the publication of the Reflector in 1894 after a dispute with students over their choice of an editor. Chapman started another paper called the Bulletin, but it was mostly a mouthpiece for the administration, and it lasted only 1 year. In 1897, students launched the Oregon Monthly, which became the Oregon Weekly, and over time, the Oregon Daily Emerald. Chapman knew that the future of the university depended in part on the development of solid public high schools in Oregon. That meant towns without high schools needed to build them, and most existing high schools needed to raise their standards. So Chapman accredited the schools that offered college prep classes, and he admitted their graduates directly into the university. Then, to encourage the development of new high schools, the regents agreed to phase out the university's prep school 1 year at a time. It took a while, but the plan worked. High schools raised their standards to become accredited, and new high schools were built. Without the state prep school to depend on, Eugene now had to build a high school too. City fathers weren't happy about the cost, and they blamed Chapman. He added to their resentment when he next took aim at the quality of the university's faculty. After 2 years, he had become fed up with several of the older professors. He'd had to force Professor Bailey to teach advanced math classes, and it had been a struggle to get George Collier to use lab work to teach physics and chemistry. In July of 1895, Chapman forced 73-year-old Mark Bailey and 68-year-old George Collier to retire. There were no pensions. The two men were beloved in Eugene, and ill will against Chapman grew. Chapman next convinced the regents to lower the salaries for the remaining faculty members by $200 a year. Between the retirements and the salary reductions, he had enough money to hire 4 young, well-trained faculty members. Frederick Young taught history and economics. Frederick Washburn took over Condon's biology classes, reducing the 73-year-old professor's workload. John Letcher took over the mathematics classes, and Charles Friedel taught physics and chemistry. The changes made a difference. By 1897, the university was offering a master's program. Professors were engaged in research, and with his teaching load reduced, Condon was at last able to start writing his book. But the cost of reforming the University of Oregon was high, and Charles H. Chapman was about to be given the bill. Eugene's resentment against Chapman came to a boil over a local school election and women's suffrage. At the time, women could vote only in school elections. When an effort was made to block even that vote, Chapman's wife Alice led a group of women in a public protest. Alice Hall Chapman was an intellectual, a doctor, and Eleanor Roosevelt's cousin, among other things. She was a powerful woman, and her husband did not dictate her actions. But he was accused of it anyway. Over the next few months, a local paper attacked him repeatedly for hiring a Japanese servant, for buying groceries in Portland, for keeping talented young men off the football team by insisting that they keep up their grades, and for opposing religion. Eugene businessmen petitioned the regents to remove Chapman. Chapman's supporters countered with more petitions, some attacking the old faculty members as incompetents. When the dust settled, the Board of Regents said there was no merit in any of the charges. But the attacks had taken the heart out of Chapman. He tendered his resignation in December of 1898, leaving to become an editorial writer for the Oregonian. J.W. Johnson was gone as well. His health had failed, and after never missing a class in 21 years, Johnson had been unable to teach for 6 months. He resigned in August and died within the month. The regents interviewed the next president before they hired him. Frank Strong had been teaching history at his alma mater when he was recruited. He had earned both his bachelor's and doctorate at Yale. Strong was 6 feet 5 inches tall. He was generally a pleasant, reserved, and religious man who loved music and tried to avoid conflict. After sizing up the university, he told a young professor he thought Oregon was about 50 years behind the times. Strong thought the university needed a little more structure, so he reorganized it. He partitioned the university into the schools and the colleges, into the preparatory programs for law, journalism, and teaching, and he added to his organizational chart the schools of music, law, and medicine. Then he shared the responsibility for running the university by appointing the first deans: F.G. Young, Dean of the New Graduate School; John Straub, Dean of Liberal Arts; Arthur Lockman, Dean of Engineering; Luella Clay Carson, Dean of Women. For students, he permitted the establishment of the first fraternity at Oregon. Sigma Nu was chartered in 1900. The fraternities and later sororities helped relieve a housing shortage in Eugene. In addition, the early fraternities were quite religious in nature, and President Strong had no problem supporting them. Enrollment was climbing, and the legislature had increased Oregon's appropriation. Strong created new departments. As Chapman had strengthened the sciences, Strong added to the humanities. He established the Department of History under Joseph Schaefer and the Department of Education under Henry Sheldon. Strong hired a staff. He had a combination registrar and secretary, and a combination purchasing agent and steward. But change never came easy at Oregon. The old faculty members criticized the new organization as pretentious. Strong had walked into a hornet's nest. Faculty members were still deeply divided over Chapman and critical of his successor. They were so contentious with each other that Strong stopped calling faculty meetings. He appointed an academic council to meet with him instead, but the regents, after receiving the inevitable complaints, ordered him to meet with the faculty once a month. The regents were conservative and concerned. Strong was their second progressive president in a row. They tightened the reins on the university's budget. Strong needed their approval to buy stationery or even to order books. He was having trouble securing their approval for bigger plans as well. Strong wanted a YMCA building on campus. The regents rescinded their permission for it after it was pointed out that the facility would violate the religious neutrality of the university. In those days, the YMCA excluded Roman Catholics, Jews, and Unitarians. Then the regents thwarted Strong's efforts to establish a summer school. Strong became discouraged, and in 1901, he accepted another job. Before he left to become the chancellor of the University of Kansas, he addressed a student assembly. He tore Oregon apart for its backward educational system and advised Oregonians to rise above their petty jealousies. But Frank Strong left behind him far more than his bitter advice. Oregon now had the structure of a modern university. By now, the regents wanted to take no more chances. They looked in their own backyard for their next president. Everyone in state education knew cheerful, optimistic Prince Lucian Campbell, the president of the state normal school in Monmouth. He had graduated from Monmouth when it was still known as Christian College and was run by his father, Thomas Campbell. He had also earned a degree in English literature from Harvard. Campbell knew and liked both Charles Chapman and Frank Strong, but he had also learned from their mistakes. He quietly started healing the wounds they'd created. He treated faculty members with respect, and he supported their research. He continued his predecessors' policies of hiring well-trained professors, and he kept the lines of communication open with the Board of Regents. Finally, he never lost sight of his belief that the university existed for the sake of the students. 1 year after Campbell arrived, Professor Thomas Condon requested that his load be lightened and his salary reduced. He was, at 81, the last member of the original faculty. Campbell agreed to his request and told the regents the university was fortunate to retain the influence of Condon's scholarship and character. But it could not last. In 1905, at the age of 83, Condon retired, but only from teaching. On his 84th birthday, while beachcombing, he discovered the fossil of the oldest and most primitive ancestor of the seal yet found. He wrote a paper on the find. It would be his last. Condon contracted influenza in early 1907. 3 weeks later, he was dead. In Eugene, every store in town closed for his funeral. The entire faculty of the university walked to his home and escorted his family to Villard Hall for the service. while newspapers around the nation marked the passing of the scientist. His friends and former students remembered him for his inspired teaching and grieved for the loss of his friendship, gentle spirit, and kindness. After the first 5 years of Campbell's administration, the enrollment at Oregon had nearly doubled. A library, now Fenton Hall, was built in 1907. A women's dormitory, called Mary Spiller Hall, opened in 1909. Not everyone in the state was pleased about the growth. Some saw it as a competitive threat to the agricultural college in Corvallis. When the two schools submitted their separate budgets to the legislature, a statewide rift became apparent. Lawmakers started taking sides in debates about funding the two institutions, and so did the public. Antagonism started to grow between the two institutions and their supporters. Oregon voters had just approved the referendum law, and over the next decade, 6 different appropriations for the University of Oregon would be referred to the voters. Oregon's appropriation in 1908 was the lowest per student of any state in the Union. The university's opponents argued it was still too much. They said the university paid too well. They said students should foot the entire cost for their own education. They argued the university should not offer any classes the agricultural college offered, and they started talking about saving money by consolidating the university and the agricultural school. The issues they raised would set the agenda for Oregon's debate over higher education for the next 20 years. The legislature created the State Board of Higher Curricula in 1909 to prevent course duplication at the state college and the university. In 1910, it moved Oregon's School of Mines and Mining to the State Agricultural College. President Campbell was criticized for the university's losses, for being too naive and idealistic to effectively protect the institution. Nonetheless, the university kept growing, as did its popular support. By 1911, there were 1,000 students on a very crowded campus, and in 1913, voters gave the university money to repair the existing buildings on campus and build new ones. Johnson Hall was completed in 1915. The next buildings were designed by the university's new architect and Dean of Architecture, Ellis Lawrence. The original Oregon Hall went up in 1916, with Hendricks Hall built as a women's residence soon thereafter. Things were looking up, until World War I interrupted everything. The university shifted gears for the war effort. Military training was compulsory for male freshmen and sophomore students. Fraternities were turned into barracks. At first, there were neither training officers nor weapons available, so students drilled with dummy wooden guns. Later, under a military commander, the Student Army Training Corps hiked through the surrounding hills and drilled on the athletic fields, digging trenches and stringing barbed wire across the campus. Throughout the war, the battalion's service flag flew in the portico of Johnson Hall. Of the more than 1,800 Oregon students and alumni who enlisted, 39 died. Pneumonia and influenza claimed most of them. After the war, enrollment jumped again at Oregon. The legislature had voted to pay the living expenses for former soldiers who wanted to go to college, and the classrooms were soon crowded again. Voters and private donors funded a remarkable campus expansion. In 1919, the new medical school building on Marquam Hill in Portland. In 1921, 5 new buildings on the Eugene campus. Commerce, education, Bell Hall, Susan Campbell Hall, and the Women's Memorial Hall, later renamed for Regent Irene Gerlinger. 1922 saw the addition of the rear structure of today's Allen Hall. In 1923, the charming addition to the Art Building and Condon Hall. President Campbell was trying to raise money for an art museum and a more adequate library when he collapsed in April of 1924. Everyone thought he had the flu. The regents appointed a committee of 3 to run the university until the president got better, but he didn't. It was colon cancer, not the flu. Prince Lucian Campbell died in August of 1925. When President Campbell started in 1902, there were 7 buildings on a 28-acre campus. 210 students were enrolled in college courses taught by 22 faculty members. By the end of Campbell's administration, there were 3,200 enrolled college students and 142 faculty members.
Because he decided that if the university was going to indeed be a university, it better have professional education. And so it was through him that we began the School of Architecture and Allied Arts and a number of other professional schools on the campus.
The other professional schools included journalism, business administration, law, sociology, and physical education. The Extension Service was successful and self-supporting. For those who thought this unpretentious optimist was too good and too idealistic to be effective, his legacy may have been surprising. But Prince Lucian Campbell had always said, optimism is the only sane attitude to take toward the world or man.
It's American music at its best. Next, from Charleston, West Virginia, watch Mountain Stage here on member-supported OPB.